Okay, so what we've just described is a plan that was deliberate, and a plan that was conceived by Balaam that resulted in a large group of Midianite and Moabite women, mainly Midianite women, to approach the Israelites, to seduce the Israelites into engaging in sexual relations and basically worship to a foreign god. The result is a plague that kills 24,000 Israelites. There was nothing noble or innocent or even neutral about this plan. However, it was actually implemented. It was deliberate, hostile, treacherous deception and destruction, and it wasn't even characteristic at all of the Midianites. Many of the Midianites were only semi-bad. Some of them were good, some of them were okay, but this little pocket of Midianites perpetrated this depersonalizing, dehumanizing atrocity on their own families and on some of the Moabite women and on many of the Israelite families, and God said enough. I struggle with this, trying to come up with a modern analogy to this that communicates. I come up with the difficulty in coming up with a modern analogy that communicates the atrocity level of what we've just looked at and discussed. It's almost like 10,000 women in advanced stages of the Ebola virus, or perhaps AIDS, since they would have survived longer, were persuaded by their city leadership to wholeheartedly travel to a different city and aggressively seduce and offer sex for free to all the married men, deliberately concealing or lying about the fact that they had Ebola or AIDS, and for a specific intent of inflicting the men and their wives and their families with this horrible and quickly fatal disease. And this decision was supported by their husbands and fathers in front of their children, and the trip was funded and planned by their government. All of this is done against a people who were no threat to them now and were actually friends and allies of a related group. The question is why would anyone defend the values of such a subculture? It's not just a matter of their own consensual sexual preferences and ethics. This was aggressive and deliberately destructive malice toward others and outsiders, and self-destruction abuse of the precious gift of the local families. So that's the story that leads us up to Numbers 31. So now I want to turn my attention to Numbers 31. What did the judgment on Medina look like in Numbers 31? Now let's go back and look at the judgment battle scene and see the details. And I'm not going to reread the passage. I've already read it in an earlier video, Numbers 31. Let's make some observations first from the text and historical background. And if you haven't read Numbers 31, either go back and watch, I believe it's video 27, or read it for yourself. Number one, only 12,000 Israelite men go into battle. This would imply that the Midianite force would have estimated between 8 to 15,000 person range. This of course means that we were not dealing with all Midianites, but only just a small tribe or subgroup of Midianites. Remember, the Midianites were made up of many different tribes. So it's not a genocide thing. Other Midianites were attacking Israel in force within 30 years, as will Moab. This number will fit roughly with the estimated number of wives, mothers, daughters that would have participated in the sexual warfare on the Israelites in the 8 to 15,000 person range, providing further support for our understanding of the scale of this action. The Moabites are not included in this judgment, only the specific Midianites behind the atrocity. The combat theaters, not Moab, but Medina, their encampments in the towns where they temporarily occupied. The number of women who would have been executed for their personal involvement in the deceptive and malicious treachery might be estimated from the number of girls spared. If the 32,000 girls were spared, we might estimate the number of boys around 20,000. Infant mortality for males is 30% higher than for females. And with 3 to 4 kids per family ratio, we can get around 12,000 sets of parents. This 12,000 number accords well with the troop count and the estimates of the number of women who approached the Israelites in the deception of Baal Peor. And so this also confronts us with the sobering fact that the number of adult Israelites who died from the plague of judgment, 24,000, roughly matches the number of adult Midianite deaths under this scenario. Israel did not get off scot-free from this horror, they were subject to God's judgment first. The 32,000 girls who were absorbed or assimilated into Israel would have actually been a small number. According to the distribution of them, the 12,000 soldiers received 16,000, half of them, making an average of 1 to 2 per household, depending on the soldiers per household ratio. The other half were distributed throughout Israel, meaning that every few families would get a young girl. This would still have been hardship on the Israelite families, who at this time were still nomadic peoples without very much material base to support life. More than one commentator has noted that this seems to be a surprise act of mercy, and it is interesting to note that Winston, in a footnote in his 18th century translation, Josephus' account of this passage, argues that this sparing of the little girls is a surprise of mercy, given the practical demands of the type of conflict or combat in the Old Testament ancient Near East. Quoting from Josephus, the slaughter of all the Midianite women that had prostituted themselves to the lewd Israelites, and the preservation of those that had been guilty therein, the last of which were no fewer than 32,000, both by particular command of God, are highly remarkable and shrewd, that even in nations otherwise for their wickedness doomed to destruction, the innocent were sometimes provincially taken care of and delivered from. Later, when Israel was more established and settled in the land and had adequate economic means, they would have been able maybe to absorb all the women and children from hostile but conquered foreign cities. But at this early stage, this is quite an impossibility. They had no need for slaves nor means to support them at this time. Another point to be made here is the only way they could absorb 32,000 girls was that 24,000, mostly adult citizens of Israel, had died as a result of the treachery of their mothers at PR earlier. This created some capacity for absorbing innocents into Israel for the moment. The remaining people were non-combat age boys, probably under the age of 12. Philo asserted that the Israelites actually spared the little boys, although the Hebrew text doesn't provide much support for this. So according to the text, though the number of boys present at the scene would have been very minimum, according to 31:9, they had already killed every male. This would mean that the reference in verse 17 to kill every male among the children would likely be a reference to any boys who had somehow hidden or been unnoticed among the group by captive children. Given the general statement of verse 9, this would imply that we would have likely been a very small number of boys left. Okay, so